On a cold winter night in 1870 in the endless Canadian wilderness, two best friends, James and Henry, followed the clues of an old legend, a huge gold mine buried in the snow-capped mountains. After days of wandering through dense forests and frozen streams, their fortunes suddenly smiled upon them. As the dim light of their lanterns shone down on the ground, they saw the glint of gold, not just a few nuggets, but a magnificent seam of gold. Joy broke out, and the two men embraced. They felt as if the world was in their hands. But while they dreamed of riches, their joy was gradually overshadowed by a strange darkness that was gathering. Just a few hours later, as they prepared to leave the area to bring back news, things took a sudden turn. The wind howled strangely, as if whispering warnings. They sensed something was wrong, but could not explain it. Then, something terrible happened. What happened to James and Henry that fateful night? Why did their great discovery turn into a curse? To understand better, let's explore each detail of this tragic and mysterious story. One spring morning in 1870, the early morning dawn was still pale on the north shore of the Saskatchewan River. The sunlight filtered through the dense forest canopy, reflecting off the water like shimmering gold. On the rugged road that skirted the riverbank, a group of horsemen advanced slowly, the silence broken only by the sound of horses' hooves hitting the soft ground and the heavy breathing of the animals. Frank Lemon sat on his horse, his eyes absently scanning the trees along the way. His wide-brimmed hat hid his tired face, and his calloused hands gripped the reins. He was the last of a group of about a dozen men hired by Lafayette Lafranc, a wealthy and ambitious investor, to search for hidden gold deposits in the Canadian wilderness. Frank had believed that this would be a life-changing opportunity. When he heard about the job, he did not hesitate. He even convinced his best friend, Blackjack, to join him. Blackjack, nicknamed after the lucky Black card, was always willing to try anything Frank suggested. But now, after weeks of relentless searching, their initial enthusiasm and confidence seemed to have run out. Frank couldn't hide his disappointment as he remembered why he had joined the journey. The thought of gold bars shining in the ground had motivated him. But the reality was, so far, all that had happened was cold winds, dense forests, and endless fatigue. Blackjack, always the optimist, was silent now, as if the scenery around them had drained their excitement. As Frank sat on his horse, something caught his eye among the dense trees to his right. Amidst the thin mist that still hung in the air, he spotted a small dirt path. The dirt path wound through the trees and disappeared into the distance. It seemed to whisper, like a secret waiting to be discovered. Frank pulled on the reins, stopping his horse. He stared at the strange path, feeling as if everything around him had faded away, leaving only the path in sight. A thought flashed through his mind. For weeks they had been focused on the river, hoping to find gold along its banks. But all their efforts had been in vain. Perhaps the gold was not in the riverbed as they had thought. Perhaps it lay deep in the woods, where no one had ever set foot. The trail was a sign of life, an invitation. Frank felt a strong urge, an inexplicable feeling that it would lead him to something important. He turned to tell the others about his discovery, to share his idea. But when he looked back, he realized that the group had continued forward, none of them noticing that he had stopped. Only his best friend Blackjack remained behind, his eyes questioning. Frank sighed, relieved that he didn't have to argue or convince the other men. He was tired of their indifference and rigid attitudes. They were only interested in completing the mission for the reward, without any curiosity or sense of adventure. Frank honestly didn't want to be with this group anymore. He turned to Blackjack, flashed a small smile, and pointed to the trail, his eyes shining as if to say, "Do you want to go this way?" Blackjack frowned, looking from Frank to the trail, then back to his friend. Finally, he shrugged, nodding in agreement. He had always trusted Frank, and if Frank thought the trail was worth exploring, then Blackjack was willing to go along. Frank laughed loudly, the excitement rekindling the fire that had nearly died down inside him. The two pulled their horses away from the main road and headed toward a small path hidden in the shade of the forest. Above, the branches of the trees intertwined like a natural canopy, the light passing through creating shimmering streaks on the ground. The chirping of birds and the scent of leaves filled Frank's nose, making the air fresher than ever. A strange feeling rose in his heart, a combination of hope, excitement, and a little worry. But he knew one thing for sure: this path was an opportunity, and he would not let it go. Blackjack was Frank's best friend, a calm and experienced man who often provided Frank with a strong moral support in difficult situations. Though quiet, Blackjack exuded confidence, and it was his calm presence that gave Frank confidence in being by his side. During the arduous gold rush, Blackjack often stayed out of the group's arguments, choosing to observe and support Frank even when his friend's decisions sometimes seemed unreasonable. This time was no different. When Frank stopped and pointed to a small trail hidden in the trees, Blackjack did not ask why or show any skepticism. He simply smiled and nodded in agreement, as if to say, "If that's the way to go, I'll go with you." The two men left the river and began their journey along a thin dirt path that led into the dense forest. As they went deeper, the trees grew denser, their large leaves blocking out the light, creating a dim space filled with only the steady tread of horses and the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. The trail wound, seemingly endless, but neither Frank nor Blackjack had any intention of turning back. There was some invisible pull that kept them going, as if the path was calling them forward. However, the air grew heavy. Frank felt as if someone or something was following them. Occasionally, he heard strange sounds, light footsteps, or faint whispers behind him. He turned to look, but apart from Blackjack and himself, there was no sign of life. "Did you hear that?" Frank whispered, trying to keep his composure. Blackjack nodded, his voice low and calm. "Yes, I heard it. But like you, I didn't see anything." The two men stopped their horses and looked back along the road they had just come. There were only the tracks of the carriage wheels, nothing else. The trees stood still, and the wind seemed to have stopped. Frank tried to calm himself, telling himself that the sounds were probably just the echoes of their own footsteps. But deep down, he didn't quite believe that explanation. Blackjack shrugged, as if to clear the air. "Maybe we're imagining things, but if there were anyone, they wouldn't bother us unless we stopped." Frank nodded, gripping the reins, and they continued on. But the strange feeling didn't go away. The faint sounds followed, as if someone was moving just a few feet away. The two friends continued on their journey, partly hoping that the trail would lead to something greater, and partly unable to shake the feeling that they had entered a place where no man belonged. Perhaps somewhere their old group was searching, hoping that Frank and Blackjack would return. But the truth was, Frank and Blackjack had no intention of rejoining the group. They had never felt like they belonged there. And in the end, they said to each other, "You know what? Let's just continue on our path." They kept going, the long trail under the dim light of a lantern leading them deeper into the wilderness. Finally, they stopped when they came to a stream. The two of them jumped off their horses, knelt on the bank, and began to scoop water to fill their jugs. The water was clear and cool. As Frank bent down, his gaze was suddenly drawn to the stream. In the clear water, he saw nuggets of gold glistening in the moonlight. Nuggets of all sizes, lying still as if waiting to be discovered. Frank couldn't believe his eyes. I mean, they'd come out here to look for gold, but he'd never thought it would be this easy in the middle of nowhere, where everyone thought it was dry. "Blackjack," Frank whispered, trying to keep his composure. He pulled Blackjack back, who still hadn't noticed the magic in the water. When Blackjack looked down, the two men were stunned. They stood looking at each other, speechless. Finally, Blackjack burst out laughing. "Oh my gosh, we really did it." But Frank, always more cautious, held up a hand and said, "Wait! Before we celebrate, let's check it out. Maybe this is just a small piece. Maybe there's a bigger source of gold further up the river." Blackjack nodded in agreement. Without hesitation, they began to prepare to follow the stream upstream where more miracles might await. Determined to find the source of the gold, Frank and Blackjack stood up, eyes filled with excitement. The two began to walk along the stream, each step slowly, always looking at the clear water. As they walked upstream, the miracle seemed to become more and more evident. Small pieces of gold glittered in the water, gradually appearing more and more, as if the stream was leading them to an endless treasure. Frank and Blackjack exchanged disbelieving glances, their hearts pounding in their chests. Finally, they came to a large rock outcrop. The water from the stream poured down like a small waterfall, gurgling through the cracks in the rocks. And right on the edge of the cliff, they saw something that stopped them both in their tracks. Giant veins of gold exposed on the rock surface. The gold veins ran long, shining in the afternoon sunlight like great golden threads woven by nature. Frank and Blackjack were momentarily stunned. This was not just a few scattered pieces of gold, but a huge gold mine, seemingly untapped. Frank whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Blackjack, do you see this? This is not just millions, maybe billions of dollars." Blackjack nodded, his eyes wide with amazement. Then suddenly, both of them exploded in extreme joy. They jumped up and hugged each other, their laughter echoing throughout the wilderness. Those moments of celebration were wild and full of happiness. But then, as the excitement died down, the two men suddenly fell silent. They stood by the gold mine, looking at each other with thoughtful eyes. The silence was not just one of amazement, but of a deep understanding of the significance of what they had just found. It was Frank who broke the silence. "Blackjack, we have just discovered something that many people probably only dream of. But what are we going to do with it?" The question hung in the air, and they knew that the road ahead would be filled with not only joy, but also great challenges and decisions. The story became more tense when Frank and Blackjack realized that they were facing a great dilemma. The reason they were in the Canadian wilderness was to search for gold on behalf of the wealthy investor Lafayette, a powerful Frenchman who had funded the entire journey. They were bound by a strict contract. If they found gold, they had to report it immediately to Lafayette. But now, standing before a giant gold mine, they began to realize the consequences of doing what they had agreed to do. If they reported it, Lafayette would quickly become one of the richest men in the world, with a fortune beyond their wildest dreams, and all Frank and Blackjack would receive was a tiny fraction of the enormous profits. Lafayette would reap a considerable sum, but nothing compared to the true value of the mine. Frank took a few steps toward the ledge, staring at the shimmering veins of gold. He gritted his teeth, turned back to Blackjack, his voice quiet but determined. "Blackjack, what do you think? If we tell, all our efforts will go to his benefit. And us? We'll be the workers left with a few gold nuggets." Blackjack, sitting on a nearby rock, looked deeply into Frank's eyes. He was silent for a moment, then sighed, saying, "Frank, I know, but we're bound by contract. If we hide this, we're not only breaking the law, but we risk losing everything if we're discovered." "That's right." Frank nodded, but his eyes still held a glimmer of hope. "But who will know? We can keep quiet, come back later, and this mine will be ours. We won't have to share it with anyone." The two fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts. On one side was the legal, moral, and safety obligations. On the other was the chance to get their hands on a huge fortune, something that could change their lives forever. Blackjack looked up at the sky, then said slowly, "Frank, if we do as you say, we're not only cheating Lafayette, but also ourselves. But I can't deny, the idea is appealing." Frank chuckled, his voice full of sarcasm. "The world isn't always fair, Blackjack. The question is, do we have the courage to take our fate into our own hands?" This dilemma was like a sharp knife, cutting through their honesty and ambition. Which decision would win? Would they stay loyal to Lafayette, or take the risky but promising path to secure the gold mine for themselves? As Frank tried to push away his unease and focus on setting up camp, the whispers seemed to echo in his ears, as if they were coming from all directions. He told himself that maybe it was just the wind whistling through the trees, or his mind playing tricks on himself after a stressful and exciting day. Blackjack returned with a large bundle of firewood, saw Frank's pensive expression, and asked, "Hey, are you okay? It looks like you just saw a ghost." Frank smiled wryly, trying to hide his nervousness. "It's okay. I'm just tired. Found a place to set up camp?" Blackjack nodded and started the fire, not realizing that Frank was constantly glancing around, as if searching for something lurking in the darkness. Night fell, bringing with it an eerie silence. The campfire flickered on the rocks and trees around them. Frank and Blackjack sat side by side, eating a simple dinner from what they had brought. But while Blackjack talked about the gold mining plan and the possible risks, Frank could hardly concentrate. He couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious voices and the feeling that someone was watching them. As the night deepened, the air around them seemed to grow heavier. The cracking of branches and the rustling of leaves in the wind made both men look around involuntarily. Blackjack, who had not paid any attention at first, began to feel uneasy. "Did you hear anything, Frank?" Blackjack asked, his voice low. Frank looked up from his position near the fire, nodding. "I heard it. Whispers! It was like this afternoon, but I don't know where it came from." The two sat in silence, listening. The whispering began again, clearer, as if someone were standing just outside the campfire's light, speaking in a language they couldn't understand. Blackjack stood up, staring into the darkness. "Who's there? Come out!" he shouted, but no one answered. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, leaving an eerie silence. They looked at each other, worry in their eyes. Frank grabbed his pistol from his pack, standing next to Blackjack. "We're not alone here." "I'm sure of it." Blackjack nodded, holding a half-burnt log as a weapon. Together they walked to the edge of the camp, the log and gun lighting only a few feet ahead. But there was nothing there, just the silent trees and the thick darkness. Back at the campfire, Frank whispered, "Maybe we shouldn't stay here too long. Tomorrow morning, we need to make a decision and leave. This place, something's not right." Blackjack agreed, but deep down, they both knew that tonight would be a long and uneasy night. January 3, 1961, 10:35 p.m. The Idaho desert stretched out in the bitter cold of winter. The sky was pitch black, without a star, only a faint moonlight illuminating the endless sand dunes. Ed Valario, an experienced physicist, sat behind the wheel, his mind in turmoil after the emergency call he had received a few minutes earlier. Explosion in reactor zone? The voice on the phone still echoed in his head. It was a top-secret test site where he had helped design and operate. No one could reach the 3 night shift workers. Ed's car shook violently as it rolled over the rough sand road. The headlights cast a dark shadow ahead, revealing the barren, isolated landscape of the desert. He was filled with anxiety and foreboding. As they approached the reactor building, the light from the headlights fell on a figure. It was his colleague, a technician Ed knew well. The man was waiting, his face showing tension. Without much discussion, they quickly retrieved their gas masks from the back of the car, adjusting them carefully before entering the building. Inside, the air was heavy. The tick-tick of the Geiger counter rang out as they advanced deeper into the building. Each step up the winding iron staircase seemed to stretch on forever. The radiation levels skyrocketed, making the machine in Valerio's hand emit an increasingly frantic sound. He looked at the number on the screen. The radiation level exceeded every safety threshold he had ever known. "This can't be happening," Valario muttered, but he knew the truth was before him. They hurried up the 3 flights of stairs, each step becoming more labored as their breathing became more labored. Every pipe, motor, and capacitor they passed was silent, as if they had sensed the disaster that had just occurred. The reactor control room. The heavy steel door was pushed open, and Valerio felt his heart stop. The scene before him was beyond words. Metal was twisted into distorted shapes, scattered across the floor. The control panel that had once been the center of the entire system was now a pile of debris. Steam rose, mixing with the dim light from the remaining bulbs. The floor was soaked with blood and water, forming large, patchy pools that reflected the light in an eerie way. Amidst the chaos, 2 bodies lay still. Their bodies were so mutilated and disfigured that it was impossible to tell who was who. Valario stood still, his hands gripping the doorframe to keep his balance. Fear began to overwhelm his mind. Where is the 3rd person? The question popped into his head, ringing like an alarm bell. He looked around, his eyes scanning the devastated room, but there was no sign of the other person. Suddenly, a movement from above caught his attention. He looked up. The sight before him froze. On the ceiling, the body of the 3rd person was pinned to the steel structure. Blood dripped from the body, mixing with the water vapor floating in the air. Valerio's eyes widened, his entire body trembling from the pressure of the horrific explosion that had caused this scene. Silence reigned, except for the incessant tick-tick of the Geiger counter. Everything seemed to be swallowed up in deathly silence. Valerio took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He and his companion took pictures of the scene with their cameras, quickly taking notes as they could. But in their hearts, they both knew that this was no ordinary accident. It was a disaster and a dire warning of the dangers of nuclear power. After leaving the building, Ed Valerio sat silently in his car. His eyes stared out at the dark horizon, but his mind was haunted by the haunting images inside the reactor. He knew that this memory would follow him for the rest of his life, a scar that would never heal. The accident at the Sohn reactor would forever go down in history as one of the most horrifying nuclear disasters. But for Valario, it was not just a story of the past. It was a memory that every time he recalled it, he had to face the fear deep in his soul.